There's a town in Pennsylvania that has been on fire for 63 years. Literally burning, underground right now, as you're watching this. It won't stop for another 250 years. But here's the part that stays with you. There are still people living there. Over the next 18 minutes, I'm going to show you 8 real places that were poisoned, erased, massacred, or abandoned, and explore why the world chose to forget them. A town where 43% of children were poisoned by lead, and their parents weren't told for years. A quiet French village where 642 people, including 205 children, were killed in a single afternoon because soldiers attacked the wrong town. An island where the Soviet Union tested anthrax, smallpox, and plague for over 40 years, then simply abandoned it. The sea that kept it isolated from the mainland, it dried up. And a nuclear catastrophe so devastating, the government covered it up for 19 years. The CIA knew. They said nothing. These aren't legends. These aren't ghost stories. Every single one of these happened, and most of them you've probably never heard of. Centralia, Pennsylvania, was founded in 1866 as a coal mining town. By the middle of the 20th century, about 1,000 people called it home. It was a quiet, ordinary place, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names. On May 27, 1962, the Borough Council made a routine decision. They hired 5 volunteer firefighters to clean up the town landfill, which sat in an abandoned strip mine pit. The firefighters set the dump on fire, something the town had done many times before. It was standard practice, but this time, the fire wasn't fully extinguished, and an unsealed opening in the pit allowed the flames to reach something no one had thought about in years, a labyrinth of abandoned coal mines running directly beneath the town. The fire didn't announce itself. It spread silently, underground, through miles of tunnels, while the people of Centralia went about their lives completely unaware. Over the next 2 decades, the government spent $3.3 million trying to stop it. They sealed openings. They dug trenches. They stuffed the mines with every material they could think of. Nothing worked. Then came Valentine's Day, 1981. 12-year-old Todd Domboski was walking through a neighbor's backyard when the ground opened beneath his feet. He plunged into a sinkhole, 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep, filled with lethal carbon monoxide gas rising from the fire below. Todd survived only because he managed to grab an exposed tree root as he fell. His 14-year-old cousin, Eric Wolfgang, heard his screams and pulled him out. A few more minutes in that hole and Todd Domboski would have been dead. Todd died in 2022. He was 53 years old. After the Domboski incident, the reality of Centralia became impossible to ignore. In 1992, Governor Bob Casey invoked eminent domain. Over 1,000 people were relocated. 500 structures were demolished. In 2002, the United States Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code, 17927. The town was effectively erased from the mail system. The fire is still burning today. It spreads 50 to 75 feet per year and has consumed over 400 acres. Steam and toxic gases still vent through cracks in the earth. The old Route 61, once known as the Graffiti Highway, had its surface buckled and cracked by underground heat before it was buried under dirt in 2020 to stop trespassers. As of right now, 5 people still live in Centralia. 5. They remain under a legal agreement that allows them to stay until they die. When the last one is gone, the town legally ceases to exist. And the fire? It's expected to burn for another 250 years. Think about that for a second. The ground beneath your feet right now, you trust it. You assume it's solid, stable, safe. In Centralia, it isn't. But at least in Centralia, you could see the smoke. In Times Beach, Missouri, the poison was invisible. Times Beach started as a quirk of marketing. In the 1920s, the St. Louis Star-Times newspaper sold plots of land for $67.50 each as a promotional summer resort. By the 1970s, it had grown into a modest community of about 2,300 people, with 23 miles of unpaved dirt roads that kicked up unbearable clouds of dust. In 1972, the town hired a waste oil hauler named Russell Bliss. For $2,400, Bliss was supposed to spray oil on the roads to keep the dust down. He did. Over 4 years, Russell Bliss sprayed approximately 160,000 gallons of waste oil across the town's roads. What nobody knew, what Bliss himself may not have fully understood, was that he had collected 6 truckloads of chemical waste from the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company in Verona, Missouri. That waste contained dioxin, a toxic byproduct of Agent Orange production from the Vietnam War. Bliss mixed the dioxin-laced waste with his oil and sprayed it everywhere. Over 25 locations in total. The first warning signs came not from people, but from animals. At Shenandoah Stables, where Bliss had also sprayed, over 40 horses died. The stable owner's 6-year-old daughter became seriously ill. At Timberline Stables, 12 more horses died, and children developed chlorachin, a severe skin condition caused by dioxin exposure. And in Times Beach, children played in those roads every day. They breathed the dust. They tracked it into their homes on the bottoms of their shoes. On December 23, 1982, the day before Christmas Eve, the Merrimack River flooded Times Beach. The dioxin-contaminated soil spread through the entire town. When the CDC tested the ground, they found dioxin levels 300 times higher than what they considered safe for human exposure. In February 1983, the federal government used Superfund money to buy out the entire town and relocate all 2,300 residents. Every building was incinerated, every structure, the water tower, everything. 265,354 tons of contaminated material were fed into an incinerator. The cleanup cost $200 million. One man, one cost-cutting decision, one entire town, gone. Today, the site where Times Beach stood is Route 66 State Park, a 419-acre park where you can hike and picnic. There is no memorial. There is no marker. There is no trace that a town ever existed there at all. Times Beach was poisoned by one man's negligence. But what happens when an entire industry poisons a town for decades, and nobody stops it? In 1913, lead and zinc were discovered in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. A town called Picher exploded into a mining boom town practically overnight. By 1926, it had a population of over 14,000 people. Between 1917 and 1947, the mines around Picher produced over $20 billion worth of ore. Then the companies left. When mining ceased in 1967, they simply walked away. They left behind 178 million tons of toxic mine waste, called chat, piled in roughly 30 massive mounds scattered in and around town. They turned off the water pumps that had been keeping the abandoned mines from flooding. The mines filled with 76,800 acre-feet of contaminated water, which began seeping to the surface. Tar Creek turned orange with toxic heavy metals. In 1983, the area was designated a Superfund site, but people were still living there. Children were still playing there. A 1994 study found that 34% of children in Picher had lead poisoning. A follow-up study in 1996 found the number had risen to 43% of children between the ages of 1 and 5. Lead poisoning in children causes permanent brain damage, learning disabilities, behavioral problems. It cannot be reversed. And those children, they had been playing on the massive chat piles like they were sand dunes, climbing them, rolling down them, breathing and ingesting lead, zinc, and cadmium with every breath. 43%, nearly half, of the children had lead poisoning, and they were playing in it. In 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers delivered a finding that should have come decades earlier. 86% of Picher's buildings, including the town school, were so badly undermined by the abandoned mines beneath them that they could collapse at any time, without warning. Then, as if Picher hadn't suffered enough, on May 10, 2008, an EF4 tornado tore through the town, killing 6 people and destroying over 160 homes. The municipality of Picher was officially dissolved on November 26, 2013. The chat piles are still there. The contaminated water is still there. Full cleanup is estimated to be 50 or more years away. Lead, dioxin, underground fire, these are horrifying. But there's something even worse. Something so toxic that simply breathing the air can kill you. Not today, not tomorrow, but decades from now when you've long forgotten you were ever there. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, blue asbestos mining began in 1941. A company town was built in 1947 to house the workers and their families. By 1961, Wittenoom was the largest town in the Pilbara, with a population of 881. It was Australia's only source of blue asbestos, the most dangerous form of asbestos known to exist. The mine closed in 1966, but by then, the damage was done, and it would take decades to reveal itself. Over 2,000 people have died of asbestos-related diseases from living or working in Wittenoom. 2,000, out of roughly 20,000 who passed through the town over its lifetime. But here is where the story becomes something else entirely. The deadly mine tailings, the waste material left over from the mining process, were repurposed. They were sold and used as fill material for children's sandpits. Parents bought asbestos waste and put it in their backyards for their children to play in, children's sandpits filled with the most lethal form of asbestos on Earth. And their parents did not know. The tailings were also spread on children's playgrounds, on the local race course, on the airport runway. Research would later show that girls who lived in Wittenoom up to age 15 had elevated rates of mesothelioma, ovarian cancer, and brain cancer in later life. 93.5% of those exposed left Wittenoom before age 16, meaning they were exposed only during childhood. And it was still enough to kill them. In December 2006, the Western Australian government officially removed the town's status. In June 2007, Wittenoom was de-gazetted. Its name physically erased from official maps and road signs. The contaminated area spans 46,840 hectares, the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere. It is now illegal to visit Wittenoom. The government has demolished virtually all remaining structures. The town does not officially exist, and yet people still go. Photographs from 2024 show visitors posing among the ruins, breathing air that could kill them 30 years from now. Wittenoom was erased from maps to hide a slow, invisible killer, but the next town on our list wasn't killed slowly. It was murdered, all at once, in a single afternoon. June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day. The 2nd Waffen-SS Panzer Division Das Reich, led by SS Major Adolf Diekmann, arrived at the quiet village of Oradour-sur-Glane at midday. SS troops surrounded the village and ordered the entire population to assemble in the market square. They announced an identity check and an inspection for hidden explosives. The men were separated from the women and children. They were marched into 6 barns and sheds around the village, where machine guns had already been positioned. The SS opened fire, aiming specifically at their legs so they could not run. Once the men were immobilized on the ground, the soldiers covered them with fuel and set the barns on fire. Many burned alive. 240 women and 205 children were locked inside the village church. The SS first threw grenades through the windows, filling the church with smoke and shrapnel. Then they set the entire church ablaze. They shot anyone who tried to escape through the windows or doors. 642 civilians were killed that afternoon. Virtually the entire population of Oradour-sur-Glane. 7 people survived, 5 men who were shielded from the gunfire by the bodies that fell on top of them, 1 child who escaped before the roundup began, and 1 woman. Her name was Marguerite Roufanche. She jumped through a window of the burning church, despite having been shot. Out of all 453 women and children who were herded into that church, Marguerite Roufanche was the only one who lived. And then there is the detail that makes this story almost impossible to process. The SS claimed the massacre was retaliation for resistance activity. But survivors and historians have confirmed that Oradour-sur-Glane had absolutely no connection to the French resistance. None. The soldiers had confused it with a different village, Oradour-sur-Glane, several miles away. They killed the wrong village. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane have been preserved exactly as they were left on that day, by order of President Charles de Gaulle. A new village was built nearby after the war. But the old village remains. You can walk through the burned-out shells of buildings, see the rusted remains of cars and bicycles, the charred walls of the church. Nothing has been rebuilt, repaired, or cleaned up since June 10, 1944. It is one of the most powerful and devastating memorial sites in the world. Oradour was a crime of violence, a crime of war. But what comes next is a crime of science, a place where governments didn't just destroy a town, they engineered death itself, and then they simply walked away. In 1948, the Soviet Union established a top-secret biological weapons laboratory on a small island in the Aral Sea called Vozrozhdeniya, which translates to Rebirth Island, an ironic name for a place designed to engineer mass death. By 1954, they had built a full testing facility called Aralsk 7, along with a town called Kantubek, to house the roughly 1,500 scientists, soldiers, and their families who lived and worked there. For over 40 years, the Soviets conducted open-air tests of some of the deadliest pathogens known to humanity: anthrax, smallpox, plague, botulinum toxin, tularemia, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis. They weaponized diseases on this island and tested how effectively they could kill. In 1972, 2 fishermen were found dead in a boat on the Aral Sea. Autopsies revealed they had died of plague that had drifted from the island's testing grounds. This was not publicly disclosed until 2002, 30 years later. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, all military personnel were evacuated from Vozrozhdeniya within weeks. Kantubek was abandoned. Equipment was left behind. Biological agent containers were improperly stored or destroyed. And here is where another Soviet-era catastrophe enters the story. The Aral Sea, the body of water that had always served as a natural barrier, isolating this bioweapons laboratory from the mainland, was shrinking. Soviet irrigation projects had been diverting its feeder rivers for decades. The island grew larger and larger. By 2008, the Aral Sea had receded so much that Vozrozhdeniya was no longer an island at all. It was connected to the mainland. The natural moat that had contained the world's deadliest pathogens was gone. In 2002, an American biochemical team neutralized between 100 and 200 tons of anthrax, the world's largest anthrax dumping ground. But many containers had already been leaking for years, and the area is still not fully decontaminated. Bioweapons abandoned on an island that stopped being an island. But if you think that's the biggest thing a government tried to hide, you haven't heard about Kyshtym. Chelyabinsk 40 was a secret Soviet closed city that did not appear on any map in the world. Over 40,000 Gulag prisoners and prisoners of war were forced to build the Mayak nuclear weapons facility and the city that surrounded it. On September 29, 1957, a cooling system failure at Mayak caused a massive explosion in a storage tank containing 70 to 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste. The blast contaminated over 52,000 square kilometers of land where at least 270,000 people lived. This was the second worst nuclear disaster in human history, a distinction it held for 29 years until Chernobyl surpassed it in 1986. And the Soviet government covered it up completely. Since Chelyabinsk 40 didn't exist on any map, the disaster couldn't be attributed to a real place. It was eventually named after the nearest town that did appear on a map, Kyshtym. The world did not learn what had happened until 1976, 19 years after the explosion, when an exiled Soviet biologist named Boris Medvedev published the details in the British journal New Scientist. 19 years. And here is perhaps the most enraging detail of all. The CIA reportedly knew about the Kyshtym disaster. They had the intelligence, but they chose to keep it secret because publicly acknowledging a catastrophic nuclear accident would have undermined America's own argument that nuclear energy was safe. 19 years, the second worst nuclear catastrophe in human history. And the world didn't know, and the CIA knew. They chose silence. Meanwhile, the villages surrounding the blast site were evacuated, but not for weeks, or in some cases months, after the explosion. By then, residents had been living in heavily contaminated areas, eating contaminated food, drinking contaminated water. For weeks. Ozyorsk, the city formerly known as Chelyabinsk 40, remains a closed city to this day. Population, approximately 82,000. In April of 1986, 49,360 people were evacuated from Pripyat, Ukraine, after the Chernobyl disaster. They were told they would return within 3 days. They never did. An amusement park, including a Ferris wheel, had been scheduled to open just 5 days later for May Day celebrations. It never opened. It still stands, rusting, in an empty city being slowly swallowed by forest. Just before Christmas of 1943, the residents of Tynem, a small village in Dorset, England, were ordered to leave their homes so the military could use the land for training. They were promised it was temporary. For the duration of the war, the last resident pinned a note to the church door, expressing faith that they would return. The war ended. Their village was never given back. You'll be back in 3 days. For the duration of the war, they never came back. There is a thread that runs through every one of these stories. In Picher, children climbed toxic mountains like playground equipment. In Wittenoom, parents filled sand pits with the deadliest substance they could have chosen. In Times Beach, kids played in roads soaked with poison. In Oradour, 205 children were locked in a church. In every case, it was the children who paid the highest price for decisions they had no part in making. And here is what haunts me most about all of this. These stories are not ancient history. Centralia is still burning, right now, beneath the surface. Wittenoom's soil is still toxic. Breathing the air can still kill you. Picher's chat piles still loom over empty streets, and the cleanup is half a century away. Vozrozhdeniya is connected to the mainland, and it is not fully decontaminated. The most unsettling thing about these stories isn't that they happened, it's that they could happen again. Right now, somewhere, a decision is being made to cut costs, to keep a secret, to look the other way, and an entire community has no idea. If this changed how you see the world around you, subscribe, because we're going deeper. Nature reclaims everything, but some places nature doesn't want back.